Greetings and welcome to Youtique Bridal and Lifestyle Designs. In this video, I'm going to show you the process of how I sewed my black boho blouse. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. In part 1, I showed you how I created the muslin using McCall's M7723. Using the same pattern, I am creating a bridal top for part 3. So I found this fabric that I really liked the pattern, and I played around with it until it resembled my inspiration board, which I will link it in the description box below. So for the bodice, I am using the fashion fabric, an organza, and a cotton fabric. For the sleeve, I am using chiffon, and for the lining, I am using this beautiful silk fabric I purchased from So Much Fabric. For the notions, I have the separating zipper, 2 buttons, the ruffled trim, the hook and eye, and 2 snap buttons. So I have taken apart the muslin, and we will now start on the front bodice. To narrow the pattern, I'm going to cut along the zigzag line. I will overlap the fabric to the width I like and also pay attention to the pattern. Next, I will pin it together to stabilize the fabric. I had cut to size my cotton fabric, my organza fabric, and I will lay and center the fashion fabric on top. I will repin through all 3 layers. I added some pins onto the other side as well. So now I have my main fashion fabric, the organza, and the cotton fabric. Now I'm going to stitch where it overlaps using a narrow zigzag. And this resembles the stitches in the fabric. Now I will flip the fabric over and trim off the excess fabric. Center the muslin pattern on top of the fashion fabric and pin. Lay it on top of the transfer paper and using a tracing wheel, transfer the pattern. Here I thread traced the seam lines, and I later realized that the pattern was not symmetrical. Here you can see 2 lines on the right side and 1 on the left. So I played around with a zigzag stitch to match the line. It matched nicely, however, my black thread did not match the fabric thread. I'll figure something out later. So let's start on the back bodice. I stitched the organza onto the cotton fabric so that I can play with the design. Here I'm lining up the design with the seam line. Next, I will pin it to stabilize the fabric. I will use the contrast color to thread trace the seam lines. When I am complete, I will flip it over and you can see the seam lines. Next, I'm going to remove the pins and trim down the excess fabric. Repeat for the other side. I now have the back bodice pieces complete. From the fabric I trimmed off earlier from the center bodice, I will use that for my waistband. I've completed the front, so here is the same process for the back. I have the fashion fabric, the organza, and the cotton. So I will thread trace the seam line, and I will see the seam line through the fashion fabric as well. Now I'm going to pin on the ruffle trim, and then I will cut the trim in half and use it on the other side. Now I will sew the trim on along the seam line. With the ruffle tucked in, I am going to match up the seam lines and pin. Now I will sew along the seam line. And this is how it will look. I will now attach the front and the back bodice together at the shoulder seams. So I will line up the seams and pin and then sew. And this is how it will look. Next, I'm going to iron down the seams and do a catch stitch for both shoulder seams. For the sleeve, I'm going to trim it down to the 5/8 inch seam allowance. I will do the same for the lower sleeve as well as the ruffle. Now for the ruffle, I'm going to carefully use a lighter and burn the edge of the fabric. I am only doing this because it is a synthetic fabric and it will prevent it from fraying. Do not use this method on natural fibers. Also cut slits along the inside of the ruffle. Now for the lower sleeve, I'm going to pin the sides together. I will sew it with a French seam and then iron it out. Now I will take the ruffle and place it over the lower sleeve and pin. Repeat it for the other sleeve. For the upper sleeve, I am going to transfer the markings onto the chiffon fabric by using the tacking stitch. It is a loose stitch that will allow me to match up the markings to the bodice. I match up the markings and then I will pin it together. Then I will stitch it. And this is how it will look after it is sewn together. Now I will pin the side seams together and sew along the sides. I will also press the side seams and then do a catch stitch. And the seams should lay nicely. I have attached the lower sleeve and now I will gather the cuff at the sewing machine. Because I am considering the measurement of my wrist, I will pull the upper thread about double the length of my wrist. I will then do a quick spin of the wheel so that I can catch the lower thread. And then I will pull the lower thread out behind the presser foot. Now I will set up the upper thread and using the widest zigzag stitch, I will sew with a zigzag stitch over my upper thread and just follow the upper thread. You can see here the zigzag stitch on the thread, and then when I pull, it will gather. So I will do this along the whole cuff of the sleeve. I decided one night I wanted the waistband wider, so I took it apart and redid it, and I decided to use the original waistband as the sleeve cuff. So I thread traced the cuff, and the ruffled side is the bottom part of my cuff. So I will pin the top part of the cuff to my gathered sleeve and then base stitch. I will sew it together and now I will line it with the silk fabric. I did attempt the buttonhole with my sewing machine, but the fabric was a little thick, so I ended up using a snap button and sewing the button on top. I have attached the silk fabric at the neckline, and with the right sides facing each other, I am going to tuck in the ruffle and pin at the hem. And then I will sew it along the hemline. Now going from the side, I am going to flip it inside out. Now I will pin the silk to the bottom fabric and do an invisible stitch. I will do a catch stitch, making sure I stay on the seam lines. I will follow through all the way to the other side. Now I will pin and stitch the armhole. I have sewn the zipper and I will pin the lining down and stitch. I attach the hook and eye. Finally, I will remove all the thread tracing and I am complete with my blouse. I did get to wear it when I was a guest speaker at the Art Institute. Thank you, Professor Broussard, for inviting me to speak, and to the students who allowed me to share my passion with them. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you got inspired to create something extraordinary out of the ordinary.